tonight's talk is about obstacles and the 6 enemies. So the chant to Ganesh is traditionally used to remove obstacles of any variety that might come up in any type of enterprise. But better if that enterprise is the enterprise of yoga, because those are more interesting obstacles. To sum it up very easily, when we come across an obstacle and we are extremely possessed by the goal of an activity or the fruit of an activity or the object that we've created, the obstacle is a huge pain. It seems to be in the way. Particularly in yoga, you can see how an obstacle might arise, like you get sick and you can't do your practice today. Oh, rats, oh, curses, I can't practice. Or you tear your hamstrings off your sitting bones. And, oh, can't do the 3rd series today. My yoga is ruined. My life is ruined. And so whenever we kind of objectify ourselves and then reduce ourselves to these kind of beings that are trapped in the time continuum, that have to achieve something, that have to get somewhere, or even have to get to the point of becoming awakened so that then we don't have to get anywhere. We can sit down like Ganesh and just be there, radiate. Obstacles do arise. And when we invoke Ganesh, there's a little more to the way that Ganesh removes obstacles. Ganesh is considered to be very rotund. Besides having an elephant head, he has a human body, but he's kind of working on trying to make it as elephant-like as possible by eating a lot. So Ganesh is very portly, and he likes to get in the way of people who take themselves seriously. Creating any type of obstacle. But there's a very famous chant called the Ganesha, what's that called? Atharvashirsam. And it's a scripture, and it starts out saying to Ganesh, Tvameva pratyaksham brahmasi. Some of you know that chant from the teacher's training where we're chanting to the Vayu, the wind god, saying, Tvameva pratyaksham tattvamasi, that you are the perceivable Brahman. Brahman meaning referring to spirit or God or reality, whatever other words you like to define that with. So the chant is saying to Ganesh, you are the perceivable Brahman. And so at first the mind goes back and thinks, well, what does Ganesh is this elephant god? Sometimes sits on a throne, sometimes sits on a rat. And you think, well, that's the perceivable Brahman. It's the picture of Ganesh on the Indian calendars. And that isn't what is actually meant by that, to my understanding. It actually means what you are perceiving is Ganesh, is Brahman. Which is fascinating because all of a sudden what you're perceiving is no longer an obstacle, or is no longer whatever your mind has decided that it is. It isn't that anymore. It is now the perceivable Brahman. Even the pain in your knee, or the pain in your back, or the pain in your sacrum, or the compression in the vertebra, or the fact that your arms don't lift up very well anymore, or you're as stiff as a board when you start back bending. Normally the mind, being so linearly oriented, interprets this as an obstacle. Or the fact there are other obstacles that can appear outside of yoga practice that are part of the greater yoga practice, such as tax time. There's an obstacle. Or the fact that you're lazy, or the fact that you're not smart enough to understand this topic, or the fact that the mind just flickers all over the place, the fact that you're addicted to something. All of these, there are thousands of different types of obstacles that arise. All of them are pratyaksha Brahman. They're all perceivable Brahman, and to the yogin or yogini, they are interpreted as Ganesh. So, very different way to look at these obstacles. Try it. And what that does is it allows you then to meditate on or to observe that which you're observing already. And the mind can rest there without the thinking, well, I'll simply meditate on this sensation pattern secretly to get rid of it. Okay. The mind is very smart. In fact, your intelligence is smarter than you are. And it knows any kind of trick that you're using in practice. Yes, I'll simply sit here and observe this sensation in order to get rid of it. Say you have a headache. And actually, it might work for now. Well, I'll simply sit and observe it. And as soon as you're merely observing it, and there's no longer the motivation of getting rid of it, it is being perceived as pratyaksha Brahman, and then you couldn't keep it if you wanted to. It will dissolve away. But maybe the sensations will return the next day as a stubborn obstacle. And so what we need to contemplate and what we need to do is often what's arising for us. It's what's up for us in our life. And the general pattern of the mind is to try anything but that. And so the practice of chanting to Ganesh is, when it is basically symbolic of that, you have to be able to interpret the Ganesh chant, or it becomes just another way of covering up the obstacle. I need to, tell somebody I'm sorry. And if you've ever been in that situation, I've read about it. Okay. And then when you finally apologize to someone for having done something to them, you feel so much better. You go, I'm glad we finally told them that, or we finally talked about it. Whew, I can finally breathe again. You've done what needs to be done. You've actually faced it. But if you take the Ganesh chant and then rather than going and making that apology or writing that letter or doing whatever it is that needs to be done, paying your taxes, you simply say, I'm just going to do and you just become tenser, chanting and chanting more and more, avoiding what you need to do. And this is what the religious mind does. Rather than avoiding my fears or avoiding reality as it is, in which I don't know anything, I'm just going to try to take the form of spiritual practice and I'll turn it into religious practice, and I'll cover up the situation. And then after chanting and chanting frenetically for hours and hours, then I'll do 1,000 sun salutations, hoping that'll make me forget the fact that I need to do something else. Like, have you ever done that? I've done that. How can I avoid real life? I'll run off to India and I'll become a sadhu. I'll learn all of the chants and all of the mantras, and I'll become healthy and cleaned out. That way I won't have to deal with the fact that I lived in the 20th century. Now it's the 21st century. Didn't work. So upon being cast back into my real life, back into the name that my parents gave me, bless them. Then I go, Ganesh is the Pratyaksha Brahman. It is this entire situation, as it is utterly, purely, fantastically, it is spiritual, it is Brahman, it's that. So I'm practicing paying attention to what arises, rather than paying attention to what doesn't arise, which is extremely difficult and frustrating. So, the classical discussion of obstacles is in the first chapter of the Yoga Sutra. In that chapter, sage Patanjali has defined yoga in a number of different ways. Initially as the cessation of the patterning of the mind, or the citta vrittis. They all of a sudden are suspended as if time itself had stopped. And in that state of nirodha, or suspension, the reality as it is just is there. And Patanjali uses the words, the seer, or pure consciousness, stands in its own form, liberated, completely free. But in order to, one should experience that rather than simply learn the words. So one has to find nirodha. And so then Patanjali goes on to say that he talks about the different states of mind and says all of them, all of the different states of the vrittis can be suspended through practice, and then through, more important than practice, which would be, say, like frenetically chanting a mantra, doing sun salutations until you die, is vairagyam, or letting go, just like, and allowing things to go, or in another sense, allowing things to shine forth as they are, without the mind trying to change them, or trying to fix them up, or trying to make them complete, but knowing that they are, as they are completely fine and complete. So, abhyasa practice, mixed or done simultaneously with complete release of vairagyam. And then he goes on to define samadhi as yoga, and samadhi is the entering of the mind into deep meditation in which the mind ceases to construct objects as it becomes fixed on a particular thing. And so the distinction between subject and object is gone in samadhi. And this gives the insight that whatever is being observed is actually empty of having a separate self. He calls that svarupa, which means self, its own form, shunya, empty. So when one perceives anything in the world as being empty of self-form, then one is having the insight that they also have no self-form, and that it is all basically one, that it's all an interconnected tapestry. And this tool, or this power of yoga, or samadhi, then has different phases. And he goes on to describe that for some people, samadhi just comes naturally. And eventually, all of us will fall into that category, where you just let the nature of beingness itself be there. You just sit down at the end of the day or the beginning of the day, and you just go, you just fix your eyes on whatever's there, and back of your palate releases, the root of the palate opens, and samadhi is there. Very simple for very few people. Then Patanjali says, but for others, and he needed someone, an audience for the rest of the book, but for the rest of us, here's a few things you might want to try. And then the Yoga Sutra starts. So he describes these different practices, what they do, and the first practice he actually describes for those who don't spontaneously fall into deep samadhi is Ishvara Pranidhana. And this is actually the first technique for removing obstacles. Ishvara is code language for God, but not necessarily the concept that comes up to you in your mind when we say that. Because everybody here, if we did a survey, what comes up into your mind when we say God, it would be a different thing. It could be very fine ideas and concepts, or very fine images, or if you were a strict follower of Moses and his lineage, no image at all, for sure. Praise be to Allah, no image. Okay. But it would be different. So, but when Patanjali says Ishvara, he then gives a very brief definition because he doesn't want to get into it. He wants to describe the function of the utter surrender or complete giving up of everything to Ishvara, what that actually does in the yogic practice. And so he defines Ishvara as simply being the teacher of teachers, the Purusha, as we are all Purusha, which means pure consciousness, but pure consciousness which is not conditioned by samsara. And that's basically how he defines Ishvara. In the rest of Hinduism, Ishvara is the Lord, the controller, and all these other things that you don't have to worry about in the yogic definition. Then he says, Ishvara Pranidhana, or which means the dedication to and utter surrender to Ishvara, will create samadhi. And if we go back to the very beginning, the concept of whatever arising is Ganesh, which is considered to be a form of Ishvara. And therefore, if you simply observe it as it is, you'll start to, what's the word, pass into samadhi? Fall into samadhi. Float into samadhi. Go into samadhi. Actually, nothing goes anywhere. The state of samadhi arises, falls, whatever it does. Completely surrendering means things as they are then accepted as they are. In other words, the activity of the mind which is reducing things to theories which are partially unacceptable to us. This can't be. Ceases, nirodha, and we are able then to experience things as they are. This is the function of Ishvara Pranidhana. Reminiscent of the Upanishad, which says that all of this is enveloped by Ishvara. Therefore, pleasure comes by letting go of all of this. And they're referring to not only this, but this. And not only that, but this. Whatever it is that's arising. And the mind likes to play funny games in order to avoid this surrender. It says, do you mean this? Or, what I was thinking 2 minutes ago. It's like when I ask you, what are you thinking right now? And then you go, right now. And then all you can think of is what you were thinking a few minutes ago or a few seconds ago, or what you're maybe about to be thinking. And it's very difficult to segment the mind into being able to pull a separate observer out to look at what's going on right now. In fact, it's quite impossible and very frustrating. And so the Upanishad is designed as this, and that, and this, by the way, and that. So whatever the mind comes up with, whatever gymnastics it does, that pattern in itself, that's it. That's enveloped by Ishvara. That is Ishvara. That is Pratyaksha Brahman. And simply be with it as it is. You mean this, too? How about that? Well, that isn't perfect. The mind, I'm not sitting symmetrically. Can't surrender to that. And because we're not recognizing that all of that is Ishvara. But through the practice of devotion, one recognizes all of this is Ishvara, all of it, or to the devotional mind, all of it emanates from Ishvara, or flows out, and therefore is Ishvara. And so he goes on to say that Ishvara is represented by what is called pranava, which is the name of Om. So like in Alice in Wonderland, Alice was inquiring about the name of things had names, but she wanted to know the name of the name. Only Lewis Carroll would come up with that. Okay. But in the Yoga Sutra, this is straight out of Lewis Carroll. Om, which many people consider to be one of the name, or the generic name of Ishvara, wonderfully generic in that it isn't associated with a particular deity or not disassociated. It's considered to be the acoustic deity itself in its most generic universal form. But that name of everything is also called pranava. Pranava is the indicator for Ishvara. And then he says one can contemplate pranava, and so by chanting it. Om. And generally in traditional circles, when one chants Om and contemplates Om, there are all these other words that are added in between the Oms to keep it interesting. Rather than what we used to do back in the 60s, when we would chant Om. That was the only mantra anyone knew. So people would just sit around, Om, and then it would be in harmonics, and nobody knew any other words. And so after about 15 minutes, people would space out and their minds wander away. But the traditional way, or the orthodox way, the Vedic way of chanting Om, is Om, and then their specifics are unfolded from the Om, specific deities or specific instructions that take you back right into the meaning of Om. And so by the time you get back to the Om, it's completely fresh again. Just like when we begin our classes here at the studio, we chant Om, and then we chant Vande Gurunam Charanarvinde Sandarshita Swatma Sukhava Bhakte Ishreyase Jambrikaya Mane Samsara Hal Shantya Abahu Parushakaram Shankachakra Siddharinam Sahasrashira Samshvetam Pranamami Patanjalim Om. By the time you finally, through all that chanting, which if you know the meaning of the words, if you know how to chant it, it is so sweet, because the meaning is very interesting. And it takes you right back into the actual medium, which is the present moment. And when you finally get back to Om, it's like, it's like getting back to the downward dog pose. After Marichasana or something. I'm in the downward dog again, finally. And so, Om then is described by Patanjali as having the effect of taking the cetana, the attention, inside. In other words, off of the off of the storylines of the mind jumping from object to object, worrying about the subject, which is all emotion because the object has just done that. And so, chanting Om takes the Cetana inside for contemplation. And it says the pranava itself then removes obstacles. So it's the first remover of obstacles. And then Patanjali goes on to describe other obstacles. And these are just a few of the possibilities. I won't do the Sanskrit. Sickness. This is one that we're all familiar with. Sthana, which means to be a stick in the mud. It means to be something very stable, like a dead tree or something, is sthana, or like a boulder. And this means that you're dull or thick or kind of dumb, stupid. Basically, tamasic. Notice the relationship to sickness. Perhaps, this is like a description of some. And then we get into the mental realm. This is a fantastic obstacle. Samshaya, which means doubt. And it's actually referring to a dilemma in which you start to see a problem, but you haven't really meditatively gone into the problem deeply enough to see the other side of the problem. And so it's almost like you've been impaled on a doubt. Say, a doubt about whether there's any possibility of awakening or enlightenment. Most people don't, they would doubt that severely. They think, these talking monkeys have simply invented this religious stuff. And haven't we? As a way of avoiding things. So perhaps that doubt has more wisdom in it than the devotee has. Because, they've invented this to avoid the facts of life, which are obviously impermanence and sickness, death. So the skeptic often is very close to the truth. And what happens is that if you allow the doubt to be there, as if it were pratyaksha Brahman, all of a sudden you start to see the structure of the proposition that made up the doubt. That actually it was your intelligence that was hanging you up, because all of a sudden then you can see both sides of the argument. And this is taken even into the theistic argument. There's God, and then your mind, something in your mind, little Satan down there is going, that's the most ridiculous theory I've ever heard. God, what a joke. You're really trying to escape reality, aren't you? Says Satan in the other ear. And in fact, it's true. Okay. Because you don't see that the proposition of the deity is the intelligence creates a counter proposition. But there's no deity. And this is considered a classic obstacle in yoga, because to the yogin, who is actually experiencing reality, there is neither deity nor non-deity. The concepts are interdependent. And so the samshaya is dispelled because one starts to see the dependence of one theory on its opposite theory. And that those are merely propositions or theories that the mind makes. And so doubt is dispelled not by gritting the teeth and doing 10,000 more sun salutations, although, try it. If you do the sun salutations well, all those doubts will arise, and you'll see right through. The doubts are actually embodied, and you start to see the other side of things. In other words, you become more intelligent and you see context. And so the doubt goes away. Pramada is the next obstacle. Carelessness, negligence, intoxication, madness, coming from the word mada, which means intoxication. And of course this would recur to boozing, actually taking intoxicants, which I've read about. And then one can become intoxicated through other things, I suppose. Intoxicated by spring, intoxicated by TV, intoxicated by entertainment. They're all different types of intoxication. And these are also ways that the mind avoids reality or cheats itself out of the most intoxicating thing of all, which is considered to be reality, the sweetest thing of all. Footnote on that. Which drug should I use as an example? Okay, whatever your favorite drug is, whether it be alcohol or something else. The way it works is, I'm assuming this might not be true, but oftentimes when we take something that makes us feel good, we are creating a chemical short-circuiting. In other words, we're bringing up chemicals in the brain, perhaps dopamine, perhaps some other chemical, perhaps serotonin, and what you're getting is the response in the brain, this is the reward mechanism for having solved a problem. And this is something that evolved, biologically. So if you are successful in escaping a saber-toothed tiger, you've climbed a high enough tree that the tiger can't climb, or you've invented a spear or something and speared it, and then you can just sit down and then you go, whew, and your heart's pounding and the adrenaline is still, and you feel fantastic. You go, that's a great high. Okay, let's go out and find some more saber-tooths, and up and down. Instead of that, you find this weed, this chemical, and you take it and you get the same satisfaction that you got from having invented a spear or having done something successfully. And the problem then is not that you've had a taste of being high. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It's the fact that then you do not go back and solve the saber-tooth problem. You're simply sitting there, and all of a sudden the saber-tooth goes, they really like people who've done this intoxication thing because they're so easy to catch. And then you've got a big problem all of a sudden. You've been unable to solve those problems that you should be able to solve and derive that completely, perhaps, mundane satisfaction from. Okay. Many young people who have taken up this path of intoxication have experienced this, that though they are temporarily pleased by the intoxication, they are unable to get a job and things like that, which would provide money and food and things, shelter. So they find themselves in a bad situation. So this is considered an obstacle, pramada. Alasya is sloth or laziness. We won't even go into that. Avirati. Rati is a name for Cupid, the god of love. And so avirati means being a little bit too interested in the erotic sides of things, which can become an obstacle in the sense that it becomes an escape from reality. Though it is part of reality, when the mind objectifies it and makes an idol out of it, it becomes an escape. And therefore, the erotic mode of the mind becomes objectified, and so other people who get caught in that eroticism are objectified. And so it destroys actual healthy relationships to become avirati. And it actually ruins the rati, or the eroticism is actually spoiled by the fact that the people have been objectified and turned into sex objects. Does that make sense? So you can, by obsessing on it, you can ruin it. I think of Hugh Hefner, who is... I haven't really met the guy, and this is unfair. But maybe he is happy. I don't know. But he has really turned women into objects, himself into this icon. And the whole thing just seems miserable to me. I could be wrong. He wants to disprove that. But in other words, it's like something that the intelligence knows is extremely close to what the mystical experience is the experience of eros, because it tends to dissolve the mind. But the difficulty being is that the mind experiencing pleasure then creates objects, and in its egotism starts to pursue the objects, and that way it defeats the actual mystical experience that comes. And so being avirati is an obstacle that many of us have experienced. And we're actually destroying sensuality by objectifying it and becoming attached to it. Bhranti darshana. Is an obstacle. And what would be a form of bent philosophy? A philosophy that empiricism, yeah, idealism, realism, monism, dualism. In fact, any philosophical view can be bad philosophy because the mind clamps onto it as if it were the salvation, not knowing that any philosophy is built on presuppositions and assumptions. And so that we lose, in other words, the sense that this is merely a structure, or perhaps a useful structure that the mind creates. Just like when we grabbed onto one position in the mind, creating doubt, but if we concentrated, if we meditated on that doubt, the intelligence opened up and we got to see the opposite view. So, for example, idealism is the philosophy, the darshan, that everything is in my mind. And it's partially true. I mean, a lot of these philosophies are, they're true to an extent, but if you push them to their extreme, they break down. And so if I go to extreme idealism, it means that I believe that you are really just in my mind, which, of course, is true. My mind is reproducing the data I get and making these little sitting people all around me. Very cute. I like them. And they laugh at my jokes, okay. But if I push to what is called extreme idealism, I think, they're really just created by my mind. Because the ego always comes in, not mind, but my mind. And then I start to look at you as merely being just figments of my imagination, created for my pleasure. And then the trouble starts from there. And so the extreme idealist ends up not believing in an outside world, that there is a world beyond my perception. Okay. On the other hand, the realist is someone who thinks, well, mind is really just something that some philosopher made up. The outside world is all that's really real. And so, and this would be, we interpret them, this would be what we call the extreme materialist, the extreme realist, and we become really interested in things as they appear to be, and think, well, the outside world does really exist. And the extreme or extreme realism is that there's no mind at all, and mind becomes reduced to merely physical properties. It's just like trying to explain consciousness just based on chemistry or physics. It's very difficult. But the mind goes to extreme realism, or it goes to extreme idealism. Okay. The outside world is all that's real. The inside world is all that's real. And if you push each one to its extreme, it turns out to be that the two extremes are really the same thing. It's just like, and we can see this in political thought. If you're an extreme right-winger, you look just like an extreme left-winger. They're really the same, and they're dangerous. Do I have to explain that, or everyone's shaking? Think about it. Okay. The extreme left, we're kind of middle pathers, slightly biased we're right in the middle, slight bias to the left, just to correct for the extreme bias to the right, modern culture. But really, the middle path is I see the interdependence of both political theories, leftism and rightism, or liberalism and conservatism. If you take the conservative view too far, it becomes fascism. If you take fascism way far, it is exactly the same as communism, which was extreme leftism. And you can't tell the difference at all. They're exactly the same thing. The two things are two ends of the same stick. If you take anything out of context, in other words, you can have a philosophy, but if you, due to ego, fear, you take it out of its context, meaning you don't really understand it anymore, you believe in it. That's called Bhranti Darshanam, or bad philosophy, or literally means bad view. But Darshanam is the Sanskrit word for philosophy. And the result of it is that your yoga practice will become affected by it. And the yoga practice will be twisted or warped to serve your worldview, which is basically a way of serving your ego. Rather than dissolving the ego, it ends up enhancing the ego. Got two more obstacles. Holding the book. Holding the book upside down is a major obstacle. Alabdha bhumikatva. Not attaining one of the bhumis. Bhumi is when you come to a level of attainment or understanding in yoga. And oftentimes it's simply because of the other obstacles, or because of improper instruction or improper philosophy, one doesn't realize how good they have it already. And they're unable just to sit there with some sense of satisfaction. At least I'm alive. I'd made it through Mysore class, and I'm alive. Okay. It's pretty fantastic. It's one can become situated in one of the bhumis or levels of realization very easily, just by it sounds so simple, appreciating things as they are. We often come to yoga looking for miracles. Okay, and the miracles are usually built around some of our ego needs. Like I want to fly. That would be a nice miracle. Or I want everybody to love me. And we come for all these different motives. Just the fact, or then the mind, through its philosophy, tries to make something out of the world, or make nothing out of the world. Can't quite decide I want to make nothing or everything out of it. And finally we come to that point which Wittgenstein came to. Just the fact that anything is pretty amazing. Even in this form, this kind of incomplete form that it is currently, is rather astonishing, rather stunning. And it's almost like you've given up all your standards. Even the fact that it is just vibrating away, look at nature. Nature seems to be going on quite well in spite of what we're doing. Rocks are still doing rockness. Trees are vibrating treeness, and the air is vibrating. Quite astonishing. And so there's that simple principle of contentment, santosha. You can actually come to one of the levels of realization. And then the last of these obstacles is unsteadiness, which is just the nature of mind. When it is not soaked in intelligence, the mind is said to be like mercury. And it's very difficult to get it to hold still. It's just projecting out all over the place. Afraid of its own shadows, quite literally. Patanjali goes on to describe the symptoms of having a distracted mind. And dukkha, dormanasya, angam, ijayata, shvasa, prashvasa, vikshepa, sahabhova. Translated, that the suffering, dukkha, comes when there's distraction of the mind. And the body feels miserable. It's really the prana in the body that is imbalanced, which delivers the direct sense of misery to you. And then the breath starts moving. So this is the standard of Patanjali, that someone with a distracted mind, they're even breathing. Can you believe it? Shvasa, prashvasa, meaning that they're not absorbed in deep samadhi, in which the breath becomes extremely thin. The prana has stopped moving in the deepest meditation. And there's actual breath. There's just enough of this kind of almost umbilical breathing to keep you alive, but you're so absorbed in whatever it is you're absorbed in. It's stunned either with beauty or stunned with infinity, that the breath doesn't move. But the mind, when it's distracted, then there's pumping away with breath. Imagine that. In all of these, Patanjali says, tat pratishedha artam, or all of them can be counteracted. Eka tattva abhyasa, by the practicing the abhyasa of eka tattva. So when we've been talking about the interconnectedness of things, that is one way of expressing one tattva, meaning they're connected, they're one thing. The idealism and realism are one thing, two ends of one stick. Inhaling and exhaling are one thing. Republicans and Democrats are one thing. I'm killed there. Yeah, they're really the same thing. It's like we need a deeper intelligence to solve some of these problems. Okay. Some intelligence based in compassion, I think, rather than ego. Ekatattva abhyasa, one thing. Seeing that interconnected quality of all phenomena, including the internal phenomena, everything, allows you to contemplate things as they are. And this was basically our original solution to the obstacles. Most other solutions, and most of the solutions are like band-aids. They're considered to be temporary solutions, though perhaps necessary and though perhaps obvious. But the ultimate solution is considered to be yoga within the yogic school. Within the school of Sankhya, Sankhya is considered to be the ultimate solution. And they're really they're different words for the same thing. Other solutions are considered like patchwork. I'll put a little band-aid on it for now, but I won't get to the underlying disease, and therefore I might buy a couple of days or a couple of years with some patchwork. But the ultimate solution. So what happens when these practices occur, yoga practice, but it isn't really done well? And I think that's a pretty common phenomenon. Even if you have a good teacher, it doesn't mean your yoga practice is being done well. Even if you are a good teacher, it's no guarantee that your yoga practice is going to be done well. There's always the possibility that arising from the basic enormous mistake of ignorance, of not perceiving things as they are, the egotism that arises can take any of these solutions and twist them around very subtly into the service of the ego. So Pattabhi Jois is very fond of saying that without the practice of all the variety of angas or limbs of yoga, such as the yamas, which include non-violence and non-stealing and not taking things for the ego, and all of the limbs which then include meditation, samadhi, that without the practice of all of the limbs, practice of yoga, or what we think is the practice of yoga, starts to feed what he calls the six enemies, which are six obstacles. They're endless obstacles, if you want. I started to think about how many obstacles are there, and practically anything that came up to my mind was an obstacle. And so there are six enemies, and this is something that there are hundreds of sources for these six enemies within the Indian tradition, but they're said to sit right around the heart. And they are kama, krodha, lobha, moha, madha, matsarya. Translated, kama means lust. Okay, they're like, oh no. So, but lust, meaning in the sense of raga, just wanting stuff, and wanting it ignorantly, as in the way of making objects, sense objects out in the world that you really got to have. And this creates the subject very strongly, or the self-image that you then have to worry about, because the self-image is a fiction, and so the objectification of things in the world is also a fiction. And this is the base that creates great disappointment. Okay. So what we learn through the practice of yoga is that kama, or lust itself, when it is seen as Brahman, then the energy that is the lust is actually the vehicle of salvation. So lust itself becomes the vehicle of salvation when we start to see through we no longer objectify it. In other words, it burns so brightly that there's no object for it. So there's no disappointment. From lust, arises krodha, which means hatred or anger. And that's more obvious. But anger and hatred have an origin. They just don't. They're the big problem. Let me cultivate endless desire, endless sense objects, and then blame krodha for the misery of the world. But the krodha is born right out of kama. Kama, krodha vijayate, says the Gita. Kama, krodha, those two of the six enemies. I can feel them now. This gets personal soon. The sixth one is going to like, uh-oh. Kama, krodha. Lobha means greed. And so it is not so much the lust that we associate with eros, but it's simply the greed of the ego. And so greed can be for money, for fame, for any of that kind of stuff, for recognition. I gotta have it. I want to be the most famous yogi in the whole world, which is a very silly thing if you look at what the yoga tradition does. But it's still irresistible. Gotta have it. Gotta have it. And so when you gotta have something, you'll do anything to get it. Even a little cheating, a little fibbing. So you'll actually ruin your yoga for the lobha. Kama, krodha, lobha. Moha means delusion, confusion, basic ignorance. And so all of these different obstacles, all of these enemies, all come from not knowing, or avidya, in which the intelligence is unable to discriminate between that which is impermanent and that which is permanent. So it sees in what is actually structured out of vibration and that which is impermanent, it projects into a permanence, or separate self. And that basic ignorance is the field from which egotism arises, and then kama and krodha and lobha, and moha is when it gets to the point of, I'm confused, I'm deluded. The fifth enemy, besides time, which is ticking away, is madha, which means vanity or ego. Okay. Which can be, or pride, which can be wounded easily. Okay. And all of us are susceptible. If you have a body, if you're embodied, you're still susceptible to these, even though at times they become thin, at times we experience, profound states of insight. Because they're there, they can always come back, and this conditioning can always come back and twist everything. So pride is one of the six enemies. And the final one is matsarya, which is envy or jealousy. The green-eyed monster. Okay, very powerful. And what's interesting is the fact that you can take the technologies of yoga and the philosophies of yoga. So I like to look at yoga philosophy as being actually a collection of philosophies that are then understood to be interdependent. And then I would make the outrageous thing that that one is then free of philosophy. In other words, you go, I'm free of philosophy. I don't have to do it philosophy anymore. It's like, I'm out of school. No more professors. So this is the way to truly get free of it, is to have that insight that meditation gives you into the nature of philosophies. Where was I going with this? Oh, techniques, yeah. That the techniques of yoga, which are pranayama, samadhi, asanas, they start to produce fruits. They actually work. And they can easily be turned to enhance the ego. And this is kind of the history of humanity. And this is why in a yoga tradition, this is why yoga is taught in lineages, in order to give some guarantee that the teaching will actually be potent and will actually bear the fruit of yoga and not all of these more subtle obstacles. And so the lineages of teaching are always seeking to ground the student in the basics, in the basic realities. For example, all of the schools of yoga that I'm familiar with, that are legitimate schools, all ground the student in the first noble truth taught by the Buddha, sarvam dukkam, that the inherent nature of phenomenon is suffering. And this is, of course, it is suffering when it is perceived or misperceived, which is the nature of the mind. That all types of things, even things that seem heavenly, because they're impermanent and because they can enhance the ego, their inherent nature is suffering. And this is the part of the teaching that people don't want to hear. They don't want to hear about death, disease, old age, impermanence, unhappiness, disappointment. They'd rather hear about, it's great. Okay. But what makes it great is the fact that one has realized the reality of the First Noble Truth, of the endless misery, suffering, the sadness that is the potential of the mind. And the good news is that there's an end to suffering, and that there's a path, there's an actual way to do it, to actually wake up and see through it. Fantastic news. But if you're not grounded in the actual understanding of interconnectedness and impermanence, in the vibratory nature of all phenomena, then yoga can't bear its fruit. So at some point, any viable lineage delivers the bad news. And that's why most people, they go away. That's really depressing. But if you don't get it here, then you're going to get it, at the morgue, or you're going to get it in the ICU, When, if it's not you, it'll be somebody you love that's hooked up, and you're going to start to actually see the nature of the physical body. Oh my God. Okay. And so, any of the limbs of yoga can serve the six enemies rather than doing away with the six enemies. So be careful. This is why the Tantra is taught, or in Buddhism the Vajrayana, is taught when someone is grounded in the basics. So this is why Pattabhi Jois calls when we think of Ashtanga Yoga, what we think of is this breathing system with mudras and bandhas and all of this wild stuff. It's pretty wild. Come on an innocent day and look at, or just observe the Mysore class. You're like, oh my God. It is actually Tantra. It's very kinky Tantra. But he calls it Ashtanga Yoga, which just is the Patanjali 8 limbs, because he wants it to be grounded in the basic insight that Patanjali is giving, that everything, all phenomenon, all technique are swarupa shunyam, empty of self-form, separate form. Therefore, then the technique of Kundalini, the technique of Mudra and Bandha, and of central axis, doesn't create experiences that further delude you. Oh, I had a rush up my central channel. I'm now one of the gods. Or I had a vision. Let me tell you about my vision of this. And it's very easy to become distorted in the yoga. And so a real lineage grounds you. In other words, it's just like in electronics. You put a wire into the earth, and all of the buildup of miscellaneous charges in the electrical system drain off into the earth. And so just like that, the tradition grounds you in the present moment, in the zero experience. That experience of just simple not knowing. Simple love. Anyway, thank you very much. Time to plow through those obstacles. Step over those obstacles. No. Time to dovetail the obstacles. Time to embrace the obstacles. Getting better, yeah. Anyway, you know what I mean. Thank you very much. And there's going to be a makeup lecture, because the Mula Bandha, whatever that is, lecture didn't occur due to obstacles. And so on April the 29th, which is Sunday, there'll be a lecture called Mula Bandha, whatever that is. Here, 5:45. So thank you very much. See you all later.